The first one, which is just a continuation, is going to be in the Donbass. And if things go as they're done going now, by the end of this year, Russia will very likely have liberated or essentially liberated all of the Donbass. The last areas are Pokrovsk, this area, this trade hub, this logistics hub in the South Donbass, the last real urban area there that Russia is right now suffocating, cutting off its supply lines, strangling it, which is where the Kiev regime is trying to buy time with these intensive counterattacks. But it's just a matter of time, even then, right? That's known. The other one is in the north of the Donbass. That's Seversk. This is a very tough geography. Russia has been essentially fighting in Seversk for 2 years now, right? And the Kiev regime has pushed them back again and again. But Russia's not taking them head on. They're following the same strategy now of suffocating and cutting off their supply lines. And even Western, military analysts and the Kiev regime interlocutors are saying that it looks really bad there, right? That this suffocation strategy is going, unfortunately for their side, going to have its due. So those are the two outliers. And then the last is this last main defensive line in the Donbass, right? And that is the Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka line. And right now, Russia is already moving in on Konstantinovka, right? That's just north of Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, which is the Kiev regime is just conducting. Russia's essentially taken Chasiv Yar. It's just counterattacks trying to buy time, at best right now. They're putting significant reinforcements there, but, it's just time buying. Trying to forestall this movement on Konstantinovka from the central Donbass. But Russia will be moving on these agglomeration, this last defensive line, through the summer. You're going to hear a lot about these towns. And it's kind of coming full circle because actually in 2014, where the uprising against the West-backed Maidan Putsch began in the Donbass region is in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So this is all coming full circle back to that. Now, the other two areas where Russia is likely or could launch offensives is in the south from Zaporizhzhia in the direction of Orehov. And Orehov is a town, a logistics center, and that's where the Kiev regime based their offensive in Zaporizhzhia out of in the failed one in the summer of 2023. So that's an important center, Russia. And if Russia takes Orehov, then they can move right on Zaporizhzhia city itself. And that's a major goal, right? Russia wants. There's also the possibility in the south of a contested river crossing to take Kherson city. So big push from the south there. It's also likely that Russia will make a big push from the north into the Sumy region, right? Which they're effectively starting right now. It will likely pick up and becoming something much larger, more intense. So there's a possibility that Russia could be moving 3 different offensives at the same time, or at least 2 of those 3. One definitely in the Donbass. That's an absolute majority. And then possibly from the north and the south. And again, the idea is to stretch out the Kiev regime's defensive lines, stretch out their manpower and equipment, right, which is already spread too thin. And they hope that this will make the defensive lines crumble. That the Kiev regime's military will collapse under the pressure this summer. And we've heard warnings for months now that even the Kiev regime's military intelligence chief, the sociopathic Kirilo, I like the dark Budanov, supposedly talked about this in front of the Rada. But also it's been mentioned in the New York Times and others by people saying, well, things could get really bad this summer and things could, collapse. And we heard Putin speak to this specifically recently. He went to Murmansk to do a tour of two nuclear submarines, one of which was being freshly launched, the Archangels and the Perm. And he spoke to the sailors there, and he said that basically the government sees a real possibility that to finish off the Kiev regime's military forces with offensives this summer. So Putin seems fairly confident. He's always very cautious, right? Leaves things to the generals. He doesn't make predictions like that. So, and it's, I think, significant. And the Kiev regime is talking that Russia has gathered some 150 to 200,000 troops that have been training up for most of a year, right? Volunteer contract soldiers. This is not the 150,000 annual Russian military draft, right? All young men in Russia, or most young men in Russia, like in many countries like Israel and Sweden and others, they have to serve some small amount of time in military service. In Russia, it's a year now, right? Now, those draftees, they're not serving in the SMO, right? They're not fighting in the SMO. They will be kept very much distant from this. This happens every year. If you're hearing things about the draft and everything like that, that's a yearly thing. It actually happens twice a year. And every time the Western media makes it out to be, oh, Putin's drafting people to fight. No, it has nothing to do with that. They're not fighting in the SMO. The SMO, is all volunteer contract soldiers, and has been since the autumn of 2023. But supposedly Russia has so many troops at this point for the SMO, so many volunteer contract soldiers, that they have now built up a new offensive force of some 15 divisions, right? 15 divisions, 150,000 troops at least. And that could be an offensive force to push on Kiev, or to push up in South Ukraine and take Zaporizhzhia city, and perhaps even the Kryvyi Rog and Dnipropetrovsk, right? To move up to the Donbas, up to the Dnieper River. So that's where, right? Russia is going to launch major offensives this summer. Now, there is a possibility that the Kiev regime, considering their history, will also launch some type of suicidal offensive as well, right? Maybe at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant somewhere, but it will be, if anything, a weaker repeat of what happened in Kursk, right? That will be far too costly and is done for political and narrative reasons, and ultimately will not only not accomplish anything, but will hurt the Kiev regime's ability to defend and maintain the defensive line in the long term. But that's where we are moving into the summer. And I think it's also important to mention now how much this conflict has undergone a technological and tactical evolution since it began, right? When this began, we talked about it. It was an artillery war, right? It was artillery was sometimes up to 90% of casualties. And Russia, of course, had a huge numerical and even quality, in most terms, artillery advantage. Now, these numbers are very different. And at least as far as Russian casualties are concerned, the Russian side has admitted that 75% of their casualties, meaning dead and wounded now, are from the Kiev regime's drone attacks, right? Primarily.
Is it the Bayraktar drones that Turkey has
No,
sent in?
no, no, no. Bayraktar drones were wiped out in the beginning of the conflict. They're targets, right? Russian air defense and electronic warfare. No, we're talking little FPV drones, right? These little, often Chinese manufactured drones, right? That are assembled, that carry, this jury-rigged explosives that have become and are piloted, directly at troops or, vehicles or anything, that have become, they're used every day by both sides in the thousands, in the thousands, right? This is a drone war now, right? Artillery still plays a fairly significant part on the Russian side, right? Because they still have artillery, right? Part of the reasons why it is such a big drone war, particularly on Russian casualty terms, is the Kiev regime doesn't have much artillery left, right? They don't have fabs, right? So they have to rely on the drones. So it's probably a little lopsided. The Kiev regime's casualties probably look a little different, right? It's still probably very high with drones, these FPV drones, but there's also still probably a larger share of artillery and also strikes like the Fab glide bombs and these other things. But the Kiev regime is to a very significant extent relying on drones now because they can be assembled in these underground workshops in significant amounts, right? That it's not mass production, right? Russia is producing many, many more, but it's what the Kiev regime has and has been able to use. Now, so 75% of Russian casualties are now drones, primarily FPV drones. 20% come from artillery, right? That's 95%. 4%, only 4% of Russian casualties come from small arms, which means guns, right? Any kind of guns, pistols, assault rifles, whatever kind of guns. Only 4% of Russian casualties in this conflict right now come from small arms. 75% from drones, right? So everything is an evolution of drone warfare, of countermeasures to drones, right? Electronic warfare, but increasingly other measures, because Russia has pioneered the use of fiber optic cable drones. It seems almost impossible, right? The drones are actually connected by an extremely thin fiber optic cable, right? And if you see the pictures of the battle areas, you can see webs of these fiber optic cables forming practically a web over the sky, right? If you get the light right, it's insane. It's really amazing. But these are immune to electronic warfare blocking, right? That's why they're used. Kiev regime is starting to use them more now, too. Another thing that the Kiev regime is doing with long-range strike drones now on the Black Sea is where previously they had these almost certainly Western-supplied water surface drones that were attacking the Black Sea fleet. Russia effectively hid the Black Sea fleet out of range in the eastern Black Sea at Novorossiysk and other ports over there. So what the Kiev regime has been doing is they've turned these surface water drones into drone carriers, right? So they're long-range strike drones that the Kiev regime uses primarily to hit like oil refineries and stuff, but also some attacks like on Engels Air Force Base and the like. That's what they're using. They're very hard to detect. They just go across the Black Sea and then they're launched from there. It vastly increases the effective range. So lots of interesting things being done with drones. One of the things that both sides are doing right now, right, is they are literally creating huge. They're covering all of their main roads and logistic supply routes with nets. And when I say nets, it's not really nets. It's like fences on three sides. They're creating a cage of fence nets, right, to protect their trucks, their convoys, their logistics supplies from drones, from enemy drones, right? And they've got whole teams of engineers whose entire job is just to maintain them and to extend them further. This is a major thing that Russia started it a few months ago. The Kiev regime has started doing the same right now. And that's just, who could have predicted that war would evolve in this direction back in 2022, right? It's an evolution of warfare, a constant tactical, technological arms race going on between the Kiev regime and NATO behind them. And Russia that is happening on the battlefield. So while this conflict started out with its one foot in the 20th century, this is very much becoming the first real 21st century future war, right? And increasingly, we see that these drones are also being assisted and increasingly directed by AI. That's going to get crazy. And if you think it's crazy here, now try to imagine what a naval conflict, right? In the Taiwanese Straits or in the South China Sea between the US and China that will be entirely naval forces, missiles, air power, and drones. Lots and lots of missiles and drones, right? That will take things to a whole nother level. This is still primarily a land combat, which is why these little FPV drones are taking the tour. But that will be about a different types of drones. And Russia is launching now hundreds of strike drones, hundreds of these Garan 2 Blacks, these evolution of the Iranian Shahed drones, hundreds of them every night into Ukraine. And quite often the Ukraine replies a couple of times a week with 100 or so drones of their own long-range strike drones like this. But Russia has the air defense to knock down a significant, a majority, 60 to 70% or more of them. And the Kiev regime has effectively no air defense anymore, right, to counter this. So whether we're talking the FPV drones that are the high casualty counts on the battlefield, or this nightly war of long-range strike drones essentially serving as cheap cruise missiles, this is a drone war now. It has evolved from a largely artillery war with some drones to a largely drone war with artillery still playing a prominent role, at least on the Russian side. And that's where we're going from here. It's, as always, right, for lovers of sci-fi and everything, how far off is Skynet, right? I mean, that's what you have to ask yourself. How long till these drones are hunting down people, right? Grim to think about. Grim on the battlefield, but, even grim to think about what potential complications with singularity, AI singularities and things that could result from extensive military use of drones and robotics and other things that are starting to come onto the battlefield.